Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, Ad Nauseam listeners, to episode 40 of our little podcast. My name is David Noe. I'm here in the vomitorium with my good friend, Dr. Jeff Winkle. How's it going, Jeff?
Doing very well today. How about you?
I'm excited.
You're excited about this episode? Or just in general?
Not in general. I seldom use the E word, but...
That's why I was so shocked. Yeah.
Here I'm using the word excited because my friend, Dr. Mike Fontaine, is coming back into the vomitorium to record with us the rerun you never heard.
That's right. We had an aborted attempt at the first time around, but we're back in business now.
Yeah, lots of tech diffs the first time.
Yep.
But now we're good to go. So welcome to How to Tell a Joke with Dr. Mike Fontaine of Cornell University. Our shout out as we get started here is one that frankly is a little bit overdue, don't you think?
I think so too.
This goes to, how do we say his name?
It's Michael Krogh.
Krogh, a graduate of Calvin University, Calvin College in 2006, BA in Latin Education. Presently a teacher at Academy of the Sacred Heart in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
Teaching Latin.
Yes. He was one of your students, right?
Did you never have Mike?
No, because I came to Calvin in 2007.
Oh, man, you missed out.
It's a close miss.
You missed out. I loved having Michael in class, along with his twin brother, who, if he plays his cards right, might get a shout out at some point.
I wouldn't bet on it,
but
actually.
Not only tremendous students, but hysterical.
Yeah, really?
Yes.
He says also moonlights as a major in the United States Army Reserve.
That's right.
And sometimes goes away for a year to places where most definitely humans do not flourish, he says. He says, I had Jeff in medieval Latin my final semester at Calvin, one of my favorite classes ever.
I remember it very well.
That's some high praise, Winkle.
Yeah.
And he took a summer course on Augustine with yours truly. And I think he is one course and one exam away, probably finished by now, from getting an MA in Classics at Villanova.
I always knew I liked Michael a lot, but I learned fairly recently that his favorite movie of all time is Office Space.
Oh.
And that's in my top 3.
That's in your top 3.
So it was just another reason for me to love the guy.
So thanks so much for listening, Michael, and thanks especially for keeping the flame alive, teaching Latin out there in the hinterlands. Such a absolute crucial service that you provide.
Indeed.
And our opening quote this week, Jeff, is from Mike's book. It's from the introduction, page 27. Quote, Jay Sankey is a veteran stand-up comic and the author of Zen and the Art of Stand-Up Comedy. As he puts it, quote, I do not believe someone can be taught to be funny. Not from a book, not from a 32-week course. Either you're funny or you aren't. But if you are a naturally funny person, I believe you can learn to be a stand-up comic. So though I don't believe funny can be taught, I do believe stand-up can be taught to funny people. What do you think there, Winkle?
By and large, I would buy that. I mean, in many things, most things I would say, I'm much more of a nature versus nurture guy.
Yes.
And so I think that, you're either born with the funny or you're not. It's interesting to watch my boys grow up and them to attempt humor. And they do it a lot through imitation. Right, they repeat lines they hear in movies, or they'll do like a little routine from a comedian that I'll play on the house system, and so they learn by kind of imitation. But I think that like timing and expression, all those other intangibles that come with humor, they cannot be taught.
Are you primarily tasked with teaching these things to your sons?
Not in a kind of a formal kind of way, right? Because
you try to set an example.
I set an example, right? And
how's that working out?
It's working out great. My kids are hilarious.
So we were talking not on the way over here today, but the episode that wasn't, about different kinds of funny. Mm-hmm. And you and I both share a predilection for funny by repetition.
Funny by repetition.
If it isn't funny the first time, maybe it will be the 100th.
The 100th time, right.
And if it is funny the second time, it definitely will be the 1000th.
Right. And we've also talked about, or at least I have, about how I think there's a gendered component to that.
Okay, let's hear it.
That men are much more drawn to humor as repetition. It's like David Letterman. If you remember, he would, do some stupid joke at the beginning of the episode, which would get kind of a chuckle, and then he beats it into the ground, and by the end of the hour, it's hysterical.
Yes, or the bit he had, Know Your Cuts of Meat.
Yeah, right. So I think that's another side of it that we also have an appreciation. Absurdity, exactly. Right.
So Mrs. Winkle is a witty woman.
She is.
But she doesn't go in for the repetition.
No, she does not, right? She always accusing me of old material.
Yeah.
So you tell a joke, it's funny, you move on.
Yeah, no, that's not how it works.
It is not how it works.
If it was good once, it's better the second time.
That's right. Yeah.
And we've talked about other kinds of humor. There's slapstick, a kind of cruelty. I like watching epic fails, on YouTube. These poor folks falling off bicycles and off their skis and so forth. Did
you grow up on the Three Stooges?
Yes.
Slapping and poking. And,
definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Stooge blocks and
Yeah.
twirling around on the floor. There's also verbal comedy. Mike's going to get into some puns and things like that.
That's right.
When we start the interview in just a moment. There's funny words, right? Like when one word sounds like another word. I think that's called assonance.
Assonance, yes.
Which is a funny word in itself, isn't it?
It is, exactly. You're just letting that word kind of hang out.
I was just waiting. So we're very glad to welcome Dr. Mike Fontaine into the studio here, the Vomitorium, again, right, Jeff?
Once again. Yep. This is not the first time.
Nope.
For our listeners with the rerun that they did not hear the first time.
That's right.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us, Mike. And could you again tell us what drew you to the study of classics and to the composition of this fabulous book you've written?
Absolutely. It's all on the missing footage, though, David. No, I could tell our audience that I grew up outside New Orleans, went off to college with no idea what I wanted to do, met a wonderful professor who introduced me to classics in a course. So I did an undergrad degree at Millsaps College with wonderful professors. And then I went off to grad school. But in the interim, I had met the great Reginald Foster in Rome. And that incredible teacher of Latin, hopefully known to many, at least by name, hopefully also some in person to your audience, taught me almost everything I ever thought I could ever learn about Latin. I got the great good fortune to spend a summer and then an entire year with him at the Gregorian University. Wow. So yeah, give me a chance to do Latin actively, passively, and mostly not be afraid of not having the commentaries and that kind of thing.
Right.
So after that, I finished a PhD at Brown University. I wrote a dissertation on jokes in Roman comedy. So never let anybody say you can't make a living off of it. And subsequently, I was appointed at Cornell University 2004, and I've been here ever since. So 17 years, I think we just finished up. And just about a year and a half ago, I think, I decided to do a sequel to a book in the same series. The book was called, that first book was called How to Drink. And it is the world's first guide to the art of drinking responsibly while having a lot of fun.
Now, did you get an endorsement from Budweiser or one of those kinds of places?
Some of the fraternities around here are especially big fans of the entire. They're asking me about it. Interestingly, that book was written by you would say, an assistant professor of classics in the Reformation. The guy lived in the 1530s in Germany. And he saw the college students getting blitzed. Germany had fraternities back then. These guys were drinking till they got, blindingly drunk. And so he wrote this inspired by Ovid to try and get them to stop. Anyway, that book came out in April 2020. And right around the same time, I pitched this one to my great editor for the series, Rob Tempio at Princeton. I said, Cicero and Quintilian have the only two treatises on the ancient world on humor, what it is, jokes, how they work. And I can't promise you they're the funniest jokes you've ever heard in your life, but they have the mechanics down. They understand what humor is and how you can get ahead. So as I've been describing the book to people, how to tell a joke, I say it's a lot like this classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yes. Dale Carnegie, is that the author?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a book everybody should read.
Right. I'm 0 for 2.
Well, I'm going to have to put some in a box and send them your way. Well, okay. That great book doesn't say anything about humor. And as you probably know, humor is a tricky thing, especially at work. And so Cicero and then later Quintilian, looking back, were interested in how can you use jokes for social influence. So anybody who's on social media might be interested in that, right? How do you get like an epic meme that's going to go viral and get you 1 million likes? How do you take down your enemies? But also, how do you say something kind of witty and make new friends? And they stress over and over, like sort of there's some dangers inherent in humor, right? One is that you can offend people. They say when they have different categories, but another is telling too many jokes and coming across as a clown. And they really don't want to do that. That's not what we're trying to do here in professional life.
So in terms of, Mike, making friends and influencing people, our association began back in, I believe, 2013, right? When you and our mutual friend, Jason Petticone, you came out to what was then Calvin College, and you co-led the Biduum Calvinianum, right? The 2-day spoken Latin conference, and you gave a really riveting lecture on Plautus. And was it the Mostellaria that you were talking about then? Or was it the Menaechmi?
Yeah, it was 2013. It was a wonderful visit. I remember it vividly. And I talked about the Menaechmi, which is the one play of Plautus everybody absolutely has to read. It's identical twin boys separated around age 7. And they grow up for about 20 years. And then on the day of the play, one has been looking for the other and they meet almost. They meet everybody except each other until the very end. Hilarious. Very, very funny play.
And a direct influence on Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, very good. Yeah. The inspiration for that for The Boys from Syracuse, which was a stage musical that came out, I think, in the 60s, maybe the early 70s. Yep.
So as we approach the book here, How to Tell a Joke, it has this brilliant red cover, and we're actually giving away 2 copies of this to lucky listeners, so check out the social media. But it has this brilliant red cover, and it is reminiscent. You have to tell us, please, if this was deliberate. It's reminiscent of a Harvard series, the Loeb Classical Library. Was that intentional?
I don't think I know that series.
You don't know that one?
This book is original. You are in any way trying to...
Oh, I'm insinuating.
We're not going to... No, the color is... The first cover that they gave me as a proof was lavender. And I said, I'm just not really feeling lavender as the color for humor. So if you look at the series, they are trying hard to line up the color in some associative way. So How to Die has a black color. How to Think About God has a white cover.
Interesting.
They got a brilliant new one out, How to Make Up Your Mind, I think it's called. And by Sextus Empiricus, and half of the cover is black and the other half is black.
That's perfect.
So, look at this lavender thing. And we got a brilliant image. I had a guy Photoshop a microphone stand into Cicero's outstretched hand. This is a famous statue that listeners will see when they make it to Rome. If you go to the Supreme Court building there in Rome, he is on the outside nearest to Castle Sant'Angelo. Anyway, so we photoshopped it, and I said, what color would be good? So I said, how about some kind of Looney Tunes, orangey red, something I associate with a clown or something. And I thought this color pretty much hit it. I like it very much.
Yeah, it's a brilliant cover.
Hey, Mike, before we get too deep into the book, there's a question that I wanted to ask last time. At the beginning that I didn't. As you were talking about your own kind of education and background, what did your parents think? Did your parents ever just say, you're studying what? You're going into what? Or were they just say, hey, you love it, go for it? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is they definitely did. But I will say, and I appreciate this now with every passing year that I've been a professor, I had the greatest parents in the world. They said, go to college and study what you want. Will succeed in life if you keep trying hard. I'd been a good student in high school, and they said, you just keep trying hard, do your best, and you will find your passion. You'll learn something. Because, what do most college kids do? Or what did I do? I went off and they said, well, you're a smart kid. You should be a doctor. I don't really want to be a doctor. And all my friends are studying to be doctors. They don't really want to be doctors either. And which is true, right? I mean, at the end of like the prestige of getting into med school, then you actually have to go and become a doctor. No, my parents were supportive all the way through. And they were most pleased, graduate funding in higher ed for classics is still pretty much 100% paid if you make it into a PhD program.
Right.
And when my parents saw that, they said, he must know what he's doing. So, all right. And, my dad shook my hand and my mom gave me a kiss and they said, go seek your fortation. So that's went well for me.
Have you got them to read any Plautus, though?
Yeah, I wouldn't say my parents are the biggest fan, or even any family member for that matter, but they've always been supportive. No, I'm working on a book right now, actually, a sequel to this one called How to Grieve. And I've been reading it with my mom, actually. It is it's a Renaissance reconstruction of Cicero's famous lost speech, the Consolations, the world's first consolation to himself. So if you've heard of Boethius and these other people, they were inspired by this lost speech when his daughter died. And speech was very famous for about 400 or 500 years, went missing, reconstructed in the Renaissance. And it's so touching and so affecting that I've had my mom sort of, we've been reading back and forth on some of these passages. I say, does this sound right? She's like, no, you need to tweak that. So in a cool way.
That's really great. I love that.
So 2 questions about that. What color is the cover going to be? Is it going to be gray, perhaps?
I think blue, right? Had a
blue.
Yeah, I was thinking like a deep blue to suggest sort of discouragement, depression, sadness.
And then the second question is, when you were here last time, the episode the listener will never hear, you teased us with the possibility that this is actually what Cicero wrote. What has been rediscovered. But here you said reconstructed, so you tipped your hat a little bit. You see, I'm listening carefully. You care to say anything about that?
Sure. We're getting closer to publication, I guess. I should have teased it, but I also don't want, misinformation getting out there. So what happened was in 1573, the Renaissance is coming to an end in Italy, right? And in Venice, in this bookshop, there suddenly appear copies of this new book, and it says Marci Tulli Ciceronis Consolatio ad se ipsum. Marcus Tullius Cicero's consolation to himself. And there's no introduction of any kind. It's just this long speech. And as you read the thing, it's in like 100% Ciceronian Latin. It's amazing. It echoes everything we know of Cicero's relevant letters at the time, of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which was written right around the same time. So a lot from book 3 of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, but also everything else. And immediately people said, oh my God, where's this thing come from? There's no manuscript, no introduction. And so this war of words broke out. It was anonymous when the thing came out. And because it was purported to be Cicero's. And so a firebrand young professor at the University of Padua attacked it. He said, this thing's a fake and there's no way I'm going to let this pass as the real deal. But immediately he was defended by sort of the senior professor, this guy's former professor himself, a guy named Charles Sigonius. He's probably not famous for much, but he was at the time a very famous, influential historian of Italy, writing in Latin. And he defended it. And the two of these guys, they carried on this literary polemic for about 4 or 5 years. And the interesting thing is Sigonius went to the grave swearing that it wasn't fake. And the other guy, Riccoboni, he more or less had the goods on this guy. And they did it off stylistics, but it wasn't clear. And so for hundreds of years, scholars went back to this thing and they said, is it real or is it not real? And it was included in Cicero's Opera Omnia editions until about 150 years ago.
Really?
Yeah. If you go back to a Teubner before 1860 or so, you'll find it there.
I did not know that. For our listeners, the Teubner are the German editions of classical texts.
Exactly. And sort of the traditional, this is the main place to find anything you want.
Yeah, the best philology.
And in 1999, somebody devised a team put together a computer program. And if you think of what a computer could do in 1999,
right?
You think, well, maybe we could redo it. And it crunched all these statistics, and it says, well, these word comparisons, it's probably not by Cicero. And so as I was doing this edition, I found a smoking gun that proves it's not by Cicero.
Oh, smoking gun. There we go.
But it's fantastic. It'll be a sequel in the same series. It should be out late next year, I think.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. So as we get into this book itself, you start out by explaining something about the stand-up consul, which is on the cover, right? Cicero as the stand-up consul. And you use the term consularis scurra. And I'm hoping you can explain to us a little bit.
Yeah, that is what Cicero's enemies called him, according to the ancient biographer. They said, this guy is a scurra. Now, that's our word scurrilous in English, but that doesn't quite get what it means. That's a word that changes its meaning over time in Latin, but in Cicero's time, it seems to have meant a buffoon. And then a consularis buffoon would be a buffoon who had been a consul. So I kept going over and over. How am I going to translate this thing? A consular buffoon. Well, that doesn't mean really anything to anybody. And also, the word consul doesn't really get it in English because we have the same word. But again, the consul of ancient Rome is the president of ancient Rome in the Republic. They had two of them, just not to mislead anybody listening. They had two of them elected every year. Cicero was consul in the year 43 BCE, 63 BCE. Sorry about that. But what does it mean, right? So his enemies said, you are a consul who presents in public like a stand-up comedian.
Okay.
And boy, did that get me in a frame of mind, right? I mean, as you look around the world, just in the last 5-10 years, comedians have won elections in several different countries.
Right.
Ukraine, they've got a prime minister who was a comedian. Italy, they have somebody who made it almost to the tip top. Brazil, I think, has got a comedian.
Mm-hmm.
You think, if you think about the connection between jokes and political power,
right?
The biographers were on to something, right? And Cicero, you know this if you've ever read any speech, right? The guy's a total smartass.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see his enemies thought he was taking it too far and degrading the office. But what did he do? He keeps winning all the way to the top. The guy comes from some backwater province city, Arpinum. I've been there. There ain't too much. I don't think there was too much more back in his time. And he makes it to Rome. He's a novus homo, right? This is basically an upstart. And you say, this guy's never going to make it. And what does he do? He wins and 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 he wins all the way to the top as president, as consul, the earliest possible age. Pretty cool, right?
Yes, absolutely. So stand-up comedian, consularis scurdra, and as you were saying, comes from humble beginnings, Arpinum, he's a novus homo, and rises to the very top of the political world, but he has kind of an uncontrollable urge, is this fair to say, an uncontrollable urge to lampoon his opponents, sometimes to his own detriment.
That's exactly what Plutarch says. He says, This guy didn't know when to stop, right? Because if you make a joke at somebody's expense, they never forget it.
No.
And some of the people, in Cicero's public persona, he's ridiculing some of these people pretty harsh. If you read some of these speeches, you can see evidence of it. And then, he did it worse to Mark Antony than anybody else in the Philippics, right? So the speeches toward the very end of his life, in my own view, I would say Cicero kind of martyred himself to try and stop Mark Antony. It didn't work. And so Mark Antony had him hunted down. He was roasting Mark Antony alive over and over and over with these cutting insults and that sort of thing. So Cicero took it way too far.
Since we're talking to a legitimate expert here, I want to test something out. I often tell students that the standard way of making fun of an opponent is that you call them first a drunk, and secondly you call them homosexual, and third you say they're guilty of incest. Is that a pretty standard plate of Roman insults, whether they meant them sincerely or not? This is kind of what you do.
Definitely the drunk and definitely the incest. Yeah, those are ones that stick in my mind because the incest charge gets bandied around everywhere.
Right.
And so it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because one thing that comes out with the speeches and the humor alike from the late Republic is how much of an old boys club it was. Mm-hmm. And it's not really the culture that I think we have here in the United States, but it is the culture that I sort of see from the outside. And as I'm told by some people who live there in England, right, where people say the most unbelievably outrageous things about you. And then they all just kind of shake it off and go get a pint of beer together.
Right.
Well, there's that, in the parliament where where the prime minister has to be kind of more or less roasted. But in the round, it's fascinating to watch. And there's all of these, hear, and booing and hissing, right in the moment. Trying to imagine that happening in the U.S. Senate is, I'd kind of like to see it, actually.
Yeah, we're going to see it anytime. It'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It must have been like that in ancient Rome, though, right?
Yeah.
Where everybody's admiring how sadistic, mean, cruel you can be with this stuff.
Now, how did this square, if at all, with Cicero's stoicism? I mean, is this idea that when you're kind of, on the stage and in the moment, that's compartmentalized? Because it seems like a very unstoic thing to do, to just kind of like to go too far with your insults.
That's a great question. One thing to say, Cicero was not a bona fide Stoic. So Stoicism would have done better. He would have done better with Stoicism. He was an academic skeptic, right? So a Platonist.
Okay.
Kind of Plutarch. That does come through at the very end, right? When the Republic is falling apart, he's like, there's actually a joke about it toward the very end. I think it's in Quintilian. Cicero can't make up his mind. Should I go with Caesar? Should I go with Pompey? He said, what else would you expect from an academic skeptic? No, I mean, the joke about, so no, we have these stories that Cicero lost his nerve. There's the speech pro Milone on behalf of Milo. And when there'd been this murder on the Appian Way. If you read the speech, it's fantastic. And we have this anecdote somewhere, I can't remember where it surfaces, that says Cicero didn't actually give that speech, but when he stood up to speak in public, his knees started wobbling, he chickened out, and he stammered through something else, and Milo got convicted. And so Milo wrote him a letter after saying, that's a great speech, Cicero, if you'd actually delivered it.
Right.
I wouldn't be living in Marseille eating these delicious fish.
Isn't that the one where Clodius's supporters all stand up in the balcony at the same time and spit on cue? That's if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I remember the last time I read that with a class must have been at least 10 years ago, probably more like 15. And it was very hard to sort of picture the political environment where that kind of thing would have happened. But now, of course, it's much easier to imagine scenarios of, people ganging up, intimidating politicians, that sort of thing. So,
right. It would have been a tweet storm, right? If we were to, contemporize it.
Sure. All kinds of things you can imagine. But let's talk about the book.
Yeah. So the first half of the book is Cicero, and it's drawn primarily from what sources? How did this develop?
Great. So Cicero wrote a manual on the art of public speaking. And it's called De Oratore, 3 books. So on the orator, we would say maybe the ideal orator, how to be a public speaker. And it covers every aspect of public speaking. Some of it is pretty boring. And some of it only makes sense if you're reading Latin. But he built into it a separate module on the art of humor. And that's cool because it doesn't come from the traditional sources that he's using. But he goes back to Hellenistic, that is, say, Greek after Alexander the Great, theorizing on humor and how to use it and what the rules are for your public persona, how you stay on the good side of the fine line between being witty and not crossing it and looking like a dimwit or a buffoon. So in this one, and we know it's a discrete module, there's actually a letter from Cicero that I didn't include in the book, but he refers to it as basically a separate module. And like any dialogue of Cicero's, it's set at a particular period of time. So this can be a little disorienting. The main speakers are named Caesar and Mark Antony. And as I say in the beginning, unfortunately, it's not the Caesar and it's not the Mark Antony. These are 2 guys that nobody's ever heard of before. But Cicero distributes all his thoughts among these guys. He imagines them sitting out at a nice weekend home, some beautiful villa in the suburbs of Rome. It's in his grandfather's day. And it's sort of this meeting of the retired great orators of his grandfather's time. And I said, well, I remember the time you said this or you said that. And they're sort of reliving their glory days. And one of them says, oh, Crassus, again, not the famous Crassus.
Right.
Crassus, you are hilarious. You're the greatest of all time. And they said, well, no, actually, this other guy, Julius Caesar Strabo Vopiscus, he actually is very funny, and he knows everything about humor. So then they hand the microphone to him. He says, all right, you want to know about humor? Why don't you sit back and I'll tell you about humor? And he goes through the remainder of the dialogue that way.
That's fantastic. So I'm looking at page 63 here. And I don't know if you have it, but I can just read you a little bit or just remind you of it. Yeah, I see you have it. That's great. So it's Severe Scipio at in mala olentem. Scipio asks that in earnest, whereas it got grins, I love your translation here, it got grins when Philippus told a smelly guy, it seems you've goat me surrounded. What's going on here? What kind of dad jokery is this?
Total dad joke, right? So the Romans thought if you smell BO for the Romans was a goat. They were all comparing people to goats. So if you look over at the Latin there, And I did this on purpose, and I'll probably get dinged by the purists who don't like this kind of thing. But you can see I indented all of the punchlines.
Right.
And he is trying to establish a pun here in the Latin. And so the Latin says, I see that I have been surrounded by you. And the word for surrounded, circum venere. And so as the commentaries had already figured out, it has to be pronounced circum venire. Instead of a circum, he's trying to make it sound like the Greek letter chi.
Yeah.
And then that gets you to the word hircum, which is hircus is a goat. And as he says just a little bit down below, he says sub ridicule. It's a little funny. It's dad humorish.
You've goat me surrounded.
It's interesting, Cicero loved puns. He's famous for his puns, but in the treatise, they make the point, they say puns are not really the way to appear witty in public. So when Quintilian looks back on this, he says, yeah, Cicero had some sort of puns that really a respectable person shouldn't be making. And think about that, right? I mean, imagine some politician or some leader that you really respect. And if they're making a speech, a graduation speech, and the president starts making puns.
You got something against puns? It
would depend on the quality of the pun.
Really?
Well, I'm looking at, you're the king of puns.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're touching a third rail here.
Yeah,
Michael.
I'm starting to get a little uncomfortable about this.
I have to say, I'm with you. This is what made me so upset when I'm reading the book, because I love puns myself. I wrote a book about puns once upon a time, and I was like, why don't more people love this?
Right.
And they just but try this if you like puns. See if it gets you far in life. Cicero says you should use story.
Late for that. Cicero says you should use
story jokes, little
story
stories
jokes,
or one-liners that are not necessarily puns. And
right.
If you think about it, what happens when you don't get a pun, right?
You feel like you're outside the literary ring. You feel kind of like a failure. So maybe that's why I meet such resistance when I tell a pun, is that I've accidentally shamed other people. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's exactly what these guys suggest. Yeah, that's what Cicero and Quintilian say. Maybe not in exactly those words, but that's the idea, right? When you want to appear witty, you want something the whole room is going to get if you're trying to win. And puns are alienating because the very best ones might take you a minute to figure out.
Yeah.
But I like that. I like that feeling. Someone tells a pun, I don't quite get it, and then 4 or 5 hours later, I'm sitting at a meal and suddenly it dawns on me, right? That's really funny. That delayed gratification.
Well, Cicero would say that happens to you because you're a humorous guy. I wrote a little bit about this in the introduction. The Romans had this humoral theory of the body. And so they talk at length about this idea that if you have the right admixture of humors in you, you'll be a humorous person. So
it's all chemical.
This stuff's obvious. Exactly. Yeah, these are their
Michael, do you see any a consistency between what's funny in Plautus to what Cicero is laying down in his his theory of humor? Is there kind of a consistency in kind of a, broadly speaking, a Roman sense of humor? That's
a great question. The jokes in Roman comedy or in Plautus, not really in Terence, are much funnier. A lot of them are sort of base humor. They appeal to the body's appetites and needs.
Right.
So you find a lot of jokes about that. I do think there's a lot of puns in Plautus. That's what I wrote the book about, although I'm not sure I convinced everybody. So when I meet Plautus in the next life, I'm going to ask him, was I right about that? But the closest we get in Roman comedy is not so much among the characters in dialogue, but there are these characters, the parasites. And several of the comedies, they're about, just for the audience, there's 21 from Plautus comedies, 26 from Terence, 6 from Terence. So we got a lot of this stuff, 27 of them. These characters, the parasites, will come out and they address the stage, and they look very much like stand-up comedians. In fact, there's a comedy called The Sticus, and the parasite comes out. And it's interesting, Plautus calls them the parasitos, but the Greek character that he's imitating is called the galotopoios, the laughter maker, the jester.
Yeah.
And he goes through almost a routine. It's about maybe 80 or 100 lines long, joke after joke after joke. And those are jokes when I read this stuff with students, they typically get them right away.
Yeah.
And with Cicero's, it's a little more refined. And so I put a footnote or two in the book. We don't even know what the heck he's talking about for.
That moment of the meaning of the pun dawning on the listener, it's still waiting, right? 2,000 years later,
Well,
still hasn't dawned.
If you think about how we got all these Latin treatises, right? I mean, so Cicero wrote out a copy, and then that was copied by hand and copied by hand. And the one thing we know is every time somebody copies something by hand, they make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of cases, it seems likely that anything that a pun like that would have been seen as a spelling mistake for the word that was the joke about. And I think it's likely that a lot of this stuff was amended away by some idiotic scribe at some point in the last 2,000 years. So that probably, I mean, Latin is hard, but it's not that hard.
Yeah, so we're coming on a break here, and after the break, we want to talk about the second half of the book, which is Quintilian. But before we go to the break, you mentioned Terence, and so Mike, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to interact with a little bit of this this famous quote attributed to Caesar about Terence, that he was a puri sermonis amator, right, a lover of undimmed eloquence or pure style, something like that. But he's not funny, right? Terence isn't funny. And I remember last time you explained this so well about how Terence is the outlier.
Terence is the outlier. There's a great book that was written by a scholar about 30, 40 years ago where he basically proved this. We have all these comedians. In fact, we even have a canon of the comedians written by a guy named Volcatius Sedigitus, presumably because he had 6 fingers on each hand or something. That's what Sedigitus means, or maybe 6 toes. And so we have all of these comedians' names, and we have fragments of a whole bunch of them. And the scholar lined them all up, and he says, Terence is the odd man out. So all of them were writing in the Plautine style, the stuff that gets a lot of laughs. And then you have Terence, which is kind of strange. The guy is interested in something else. He wants this comedy of manners, quiet sophistication. And it's inevitable. When you read Terence with anybody who's never read, they say, this stuff's not funny. There's not even a single joke anywhere in here. And so people were trying to figure out what this guy was up to, but it's not laughs.
No.
But the incredible thing, as you said, is that Terence is the one who went on to become the school author.
Right.
So the funny comedians, where most of them are lost today. Plautus survives. He was considered the greatest, I guess. But what do we have? Julius Caesar. I'm trying to think who else. We have little poems from various people about Terence. And they say his colloquial Latin is the best.
Yeah.
Read it and you think, really? I actually it doesn't seem like the colloquial Latin of Cicero's letters. No. And it's not as easy as the colloquial Latin of Plautus even.
Right.
But so your guess is as good as mine. I hope Caesar really meant it when he wrote it.
Right.
I wrote papers in college and I didn't really believe. I might have done the same.
So we're going to hear from Mike about Quintilian after the break.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by Ratio Coffee. Ratio Coffee, ladies and gentlemen, listen closely, please. Mark Helwig and his team in Portland, Oregon have solved your aesthetic and brew-based problems. Why spend $4 to $6 on coffee purchased in some drive-thru when you can brew, get this, better coffee at home? The Ratio 6 and its big brother, the 8, beautiful automatic pour-over machines that consistently brew the finest Java. You want to check it out.
That's right, Jeff. The Ratio 8, this is the one I have on my countertop at home. It's 2 ratios better than yours.
You rub it in every time.
I think you got the
every
6.
time.
You got a bloom stage, don't you?
Of course. They don't come without a bloom stage.
You bloom, and then what comes next?
You bloom, and then it brews.
And then finally, ready.
Ready.
And when that little LED light flashes on the ready, and I take my carafe, the carafe that you could use it in place of a tank, maybe if you needed to invade a country or something.
Absolutely, yes.
It's heavy and solid. I take it off. I put the little rubber stopper in the top.
Yep.
I'm ready to pour out delicious coffee for the next several hours.
Exactly right. What better way to start things off?
It's fantastic. Okay. I did just this morning. And so the water comes coursing through the metallic veins, down through the cone, through my Ad Astra coffee beans. Mm-hmm. Stay tuned for the next ad. And then it's fantastic, delicious coffee. No burn flavor, no brackish tang. Jeff, how can our listeners, the coffophiles, how can they score some of this wonderful ratio coffee?
All they have to do is go to ratiocoffee.com, ratio RATIO coffee.com right now and get a 15% exclusive discount on the Ratio 6, the machine I have.
Did you say 15%?
I said 15.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. Enter the special code ANCO for 15% off the Ratio 6. ANCO, ratiocoffee.com. Check it out.
This week's episode is also brought to you by Ad Astra Coffee Roasters, the coffee that takes you to the stars, but you don't have to go per aspera through the harsh stuff.
Yes, we are thrilled to have Ad Astra Roasters on board here at Ad Navseam. Specialty coffee, veteran-owned out of Hillsdale, Michigan, just a couple hours down the road from where we are at the Vomitorium.
Absolutely. And this week, what arrived in the mail?
You want to? I'm going to let you say it. No, you're going to say it. You always say it, right?
The Huehuetenango.
And I was thinking about, have you seen Shawshank Redemption?
Yes.
Isn't that the place where...
I hate that movie. Don't even get me started.
Okay, I don't care if you hate it.
Everybody loves it. I hate it.
Isn't it where they meet up at the end? Huehuetenango, isn't that the place where they go?
Something about a boat.
There's a boat. Right. Never.
I don't know. Let's talk about coffee.
Okay.
Huehuetenango arrived in the mail this week.
Yes.
Still love Tenebris very much, but when Patrick sent me that Huehuetenango, it's really delicious. It's perfectly roasted. There are notes of, I don't know, there's a cinnamon kind of flavor in there. There's a little bit of walnut and pecan flavors. It's really complicated, delicious coffee.
Notes. There are notes in, I think.
Notes.
Exactly.
Right. I said notes, didn't I?
Did you say notes? Okay.
I did.
All right. Okay. Well, I was just underlining the note part.
Okay, fine. Take a note. But not only the Huehuetenango, what else do they have?
They got this exclusive poetry series.
Yes.
Where they've got Wordsworth and Rilke and all your favorite poets on the bag itself.
Yes, so while you're brewing up and watching the ratio do its magic, you can also read a little bit of poetry.
It's really, really nice.
So what are we giving our listeners if they, I should say, what is Ad Astra giving our listeners if they go to the site?
If they go to adastraroasters.com, ADASTRA roasters.com, you get 10% off, listeners. All you have to do is enter code ANAA to get 10% off any order, and you can also sign up for their monthly subscription.
You should definitely check it out. It's a beautiful website. They show you some of the process of how they roast these delicious beans, so check it out.
Today's episode is also sponsored by Hackett Publishing. Now, Dave, I know you've been in that situation where all you want to do is sit on the porch, smoke your cigar, and read your favorite stuff.
My classical stuff?
Yes. You're into that classical stuff. But all you can find is some horrible, turgid tome that's almost unreadable in terms of its translation.
That does happen from time to time. If I am indeed reading a translation, I don't go in for turgidity.
No, that's a good thing to avoid.
Turgidity? It does happen, but Hackett has changed all that, dear listener. With the click of a button, you can be on your way to discovering Hackett's deep well of attractive, affordable, accessible translations from the entire sweep of the Greco-Roman era.
Yeah, and not only that, but other areas of academic interest as well. They've got great classical connection, but check out their website and you can see how deep it goes.
Yes, indeed it does. I also love the Latin series that they now carry, the Lingua Latina per se Illustrata.
That's your go-to, isn't it?
It is, yes. For Hans Orberg, wonderful Latinity and very, very highly recommended. So, Jeff, once again, I have to ask, how can our listeners take advantage of what we are offering them today through Hackett?
Well, Ad Nauseanators, you too can save 20% on any order and receive free shipping from Hackett Publishing. All you have to do is go to hackettpublishing.com, HACKETT publishing.com, find the text you want, enter the code AN2021 in the box, which asks for the coupon code. Do it today.
That's a pretty hefty discount, isn't it?
20% and free shipping.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. I don't think you can get that elsewhere.
No.
You want to add that closing line once again?
Don't wait. All right, we are back. Mike, I wonder if you could talk to us about the second half of your book a bit, about the quintillion half and how that responds to the first half, and what's different, and what's kind of the argument that Quintilian is making.
Great. So Quintilian lived about 150 years after Cicero, and it's a totally different world that he's born and grows up and comes of age in. So Cicero was assassinated just as the Republic, 500 years old, was sliding into this sort of monarchy or autocracy that it never really emerged from ever again. And by the time Quintilian is born in Spain, Rome had been an empire with a single emperor for quite a long time. And he was like us. He's an academic, right? So Cicero, I always tell people, he was the man in the arena. He's the guy that gets out there and fights for the policies that he thinks are best, even at the cost of his own life. The experimental person. Quintilian, a guy like me, sitting in a study, reading all these books, trying to distill the best practices, the most effective stuff, and see what works. And he ended his career as the world's first chair of Latin literature, appointed by Trajan or Hadrian, I forget off the top of my head. And so he was sort of the first person to go back and read Cicero's handbook on the art of being an ideal public speaker. And Quintilian wrote his own sort of sequel or updated textbook in which Cicero's ideas play a part, but they're contextualized with many other people as well. So Cicero's book on the art of public speaking is 3 books long. Quintilian's is 10 or 11.
Yeah.
It's quite a bit longer. And again, though, he has what he calls a separate module on the art of humor. And he says this is essential if you want to learn how to do this stuff. And there are a lot of great models. But what I found fascinating is not only that he's read Cicero and a whole bunch of other authorities, but he's now living in a world where you have to really watch what you say. It's not the old boys network where you could take the tar out of somebody and then slap each other on the back and go get a beer. He's living in a world where stuff can get reported to the emperor. It can get reported to higher ups. If you make a joke about Augustus, do you really want to be brought in to explain that? I'm not sure you do. And so the world has totally changed. It changes his analysis of the humor a little bit, but in general, he's still interested in how you're going to win arguments in the short term and in the long term. In a way, Quintilian's is maybe even a little more effective for the social media world that we're living in today.
Absolutely.
If you put out a tweet, I hope you like that tweet.
Yes, because it can be unearthed even several years later.
You may be seeing it again. Yeah,
that's right. So the very beginning of the second half of the book on the art of humor, you quote from the Institutio Oratoria, right, book 6, and I love the idiomacy of your translations. I think you've done just a bang-up job. Now, the more idiomatic a translation is, right, you can attest to this, perhaps the shorter the shelf life, right? So sometimes what you might sacrifice in terms of immediacy, or what you gain in terms of immediacy, right, it may not last as long. I hope that's not the case, but I just wanted to read this little paragraph here because it's quite good. Yet another skill that orators should cultivate is getting the jury to laugh. Doing that breaks up their upset emotions, takes their mind off the facts, and sometimes even snaps them out of it. That's just brilliant, Mike, and gives them a fresh start when they're tired or bored. So can you talk a little bit about the kinds of translation choices that you made and how you tried to maybe balance, if that's the right term, accuracy against contemporaneity, maybe?
Yeah, thanks. I did that very deliberately with the book. I think we talked a little bit last time. It is having a total polarizing effect on readers so far. People either totally love the way I did it, or they think that Cicero and Quintilian could have never talked that way. It's impossible. In fact, a friend of mine told me that the other day. He said he couldn't have talked that way. I said, okay, you don't actually know Latin, but that's all good. But so, yeah, right. I mean, what do we want to do? These people were alive and they're trying to communicate to us. And, if you make them they don't sound stilted in Latin. And Cicero's in particular is very clear. It's colloquial Latin. These guys are bantering back and forth with each other, and they're making puns as they speak. Quintilian is making puns as he goes. And you want to sound immediate. And for me, idioms sound immediate. Phrasal verbs sound immediate. Go in instead of saying enter, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I use the word get a lot. And I tested it out on some of the neighborhood kids because I worked on this during the shutdown, the early days of the shutdown. I was under a bit of a deadline to get this thing in. And I was at the time, busy with, trying the chaos of online teaching and all that sort of thing. And so I got the neighborhood kids. I said, what are we going to call this one? Said, we're going to call it a sick burn. A sick burn. And so I said, I'm pretty sure I had never used that phrase before, but it's already, people love it. They know exactly what a sick burn is. Or they know what roasting is, right? So I had a couple of different choices. And I worked with an undergrad. She said, no, you got to say roast. roast, roast, roast. That is what the kids are saying today.
Yep. And they
So-
say lit, and they say sketch, and they say sus,
Sus, yeah.
which is short for suspicious, I guess.
Oh boy. So I tried to do is avoid slang in the
Okay.
And this is all subjective, right? But it's definitely going to have a short shelf life, and that's totally fine. That's what these books are for. Cicero's been around 2,100 years. He'll be around after me.
Oh, sure.
But what I wanted to do was reach the current moment and reach people who are not academics, reach people who don't know Latin, and just say, hey, folks, this is our world heritage here, right? I mean, these are some brilliant ideas people thought pretty hard about. So there's an audiobook for this one, as there was for the last one.
Oh, really?
And, believe it or not, people listen to Cicero and they listen to Quintilian in an audiobook.
Are you the reader, Mike?
No, they get a professional voice actor. This guy's pretty good. He can do different voices, and it's halfway between sort of an English accent and halfway between an American. So,
That's too bad Mel Blanc is not around anymore, because he would be the Looney Tunes guy. He'd be the perfect one to do this.
When we did How to Drink, I wanted Charlie Sheen to read it, but I don't think
That's very on the nose. Yeah. Well, I mentioned shelf life, but the immediacy is just phenomenal, right? If you want to know how people were talking at a particular time, you pick up an idiomatic translation from that time, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And if people don't like this, the logs are there. People can go out and see what people thought was funny 100 years ago. I can tell you, some of the jokes are not as funny in the older ones, but
or they put them into Italian, right? When it gets a little right?
Oh, I can say that there are no obscene jokes in this book. There are no obscene jokes, of course. If you read Aristophanes, there's lots of obscenity.
Sure,
right.
But Roman humor is not obscene, and Quintilian himself says, "Don't do it. Not only don't be obscene, but don't even hint at obscenity.
Really?
Because if you do, you will compromise your whole persona." Now, that said, because everybody loves this stuff, Cicero does have a letter, and it's all about obscene puns, and it's Ad Familiares 9.22.
You better pause a moment, because everyone's going to go write that down, right? Race to the internet. Quick, find it.
He had a young correspondent. There's some dude named Papirius Paitus, and this guy, I guess, they got into an argument. Does such a thing as obscenity exist? And Cicero says, I'm going to use Stoic argumentation. We're going to split it down the middle. It's either from the words or the actions. And he proves in the words section, he says, well, I can make words sound like these dirty words, but I'm not really saying the word, am I? That stuff's all out there. You can read that. No, one thing I was going to say about the translation that might be of interest is I tried to do a lot of cultural translation. Not as much as my instincts were. I was going to make it almost entirely updated, sort of social titles, political offices, technology. But various voices said, no, you're taking it too far. You should dial it back. So I really struck a balance where they sound, I hope, like people today, but it's clear that they're living in ancient Rome.
Right.
And the only ones where I really changed it was where I thought it would be totally distracting, to suddenly refer to somebody as a military tribune. Now, I don't think too many people today walking down the street know what a military tribune of ancient Rome was. So I tried to figure out what the relevant point of the person being a military tribune was and then update it. So I did a fair amount of that sort of thing.
I think it's quite successful on the whole. If you got page 153 there, I was hoping you could read us that opening paragraph, because it touches on something that Jeff asked last time about the connection between humor and appearance. I don't know if you remember that, Jeff.
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
So the part that begins, moreover, genetics.
Yeah. So he says, moreover, genetics don't merely determine whether a person's wittier and quicker at coming up with ideas, because teaching really could improve that. Now, some people just intrinsically have a special look about them. The way they move their face, such that the same jokes don't seem as funny when someone else tells them. And I can't remember, Jeff, if we talked about it last time. For me, the iconic figure is Dave Chappelle.
Yes.
When that guy tells a joke, even when he doesn't tell a joke, right?
Yes.
He starts smirking. I can't not laugh.
He's also one of those rare guys that can laugh at his own joke, and it does not come off as ridiculous and cloying and stupid. It just adds to it. He'll pop the microphone on his thigh and kind of do that backward shuffle. It's so great. It's so great.
You were asking about, I think, Jeff, you used Jim Gaffigan as an example, right? If he looked like George Clooney or Brad Pitt or even like one of us, right? With our Adonic-like appearance.
Yes. I think it's much more difficult for classically attractive people to be funny. Or like if Brad Pitt told a Gaffigan joke, I don't think it would work.
That's a brilliant idea. And if I can interject, I think you're totally right. Why? Because you remember the TV show Friends? They're doing a reunion.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't escape it when we were coming of age. Brad Pitt guest starred on an episode of Friends. And he is so horribly unfunny in that episode. It's painful to watch. And it makes it clear how talented all the other actors in the show are.
Yeah.
Because certainly at the time, he was an incredibly handsome guy. He was in all these famous movies.
He's like an Achilles, frankly. But
right. Well, I think, David, we've talked about this. If you are really attractive, you don't have to be funny, right? Because people are naturally drawn to you. You don't have to work, and so you have to develop a sense of humor. If your notch is below
you're
that,
compensating.
If you want to attract women. Is
that where this podcast is going, Winkle?
Well, you have to. If you can't draw them with just your aura,
you
have to be funny.
Well, I think people like to be entertained, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, humor can go a long way to make it up when you think any kind of deficits that you think. I mean, in my own case, I'm both handsome and funny, Jeff. So challenges. Humor, everybody loves humor, right? In a partner, in friends, everything. Yeah. We talked a little bit, we should talk a little bit about the concept of humor in Latin. So the first thing, actually, I can say this. When you read the book, if you look at the Latin, you'll see Latin doesn't have a word for humor in the sense that we use it.
Right.
I mean, of course, again, it gets challenging. Humor is a Latin word, but back then it means chemical. But so they have to use all these strange, what we call the hendiades. Does the audience know this fancy term?
I don't know, right? The 2 through 1, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. So you need two words to say the same thing, and you put the word "and" in between them. So at the very, very beginning of Cicero's, he talks about, I think, joking and funny stories. And in the context, it's obvious that he's talking about humor in the general concept. So Latin as a language doesn't even get a word for humor until the Italian Renaissance.
Wow.
When some guy finally just says, all right, enough, basta. And he coins a word, and it's facetudo, facetitude. Would be the English word, I guess. And
that's not funny, Mike. Facetitude.
Wow, it's meant socially. He writes a brilliant supplement to all this, and he talks about how humor can lubricate social life.
Yeah.
When you walk into an awkward space or empty silence, you can fill it with humor. Yeah, sure, you can win the room.
As we began today, we're talking about Cicero as successful politician. Any politicians who try to entertain the audience? I mean, we mentioned last time, and you and I seemed to have some agreement on this, that Quintilian tells us there are 3 purposes of communication, right? Ducere, delectare, movere, and most politicians, they don't work at all to entertain us. They're just right and left, dull as dirt. So why is that, and what has changed?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have seen politicians who tell lots and lots and lots of jokes. They can tell some pretty mean-spirited jokes, in fact. And people, sometimes they win and sometimes they don't win. If you look across the landscape today, they don't seem interested in entertaining us. And it's interesting to sort of puzzle out why. Why don't they want to entertain us? Well, of course, some have serious policy points to make, but maybe it's what people want today. Do we want to be entertained, or do we want people who are going to engage with the issues?
I want to be entertained, just
Yeah,
just for the record.
Most people do. You know who's not good at humor at all is Joe Biden. I don't know if you follow these things. I watch, politicians and public figures trying to use humor. Joe Biden so far has not been very good at all. And he gave a speech just last week to a graduating class. And
He's a military class, wasn't it?
That's it. You saw that one.
I saw the clip.
And nobody laughed. And he basically said, "Oh, what's wrong with you people? That's not." And if you should have read my book, because just you would say that's what you don't insult people when they don't they don't laugh. So he's, who is, however, very good at strategic humor. Excellent. This was also in the news last week. Is Jeff Bezos.
Oh, really?
If you remember when he was busted for having an affair. What was that, a year or two ago?
Mm-hmm.
And it was big news, and all kinds of compromising information was coming out, and he was being shamed all across the planet. This article I read last week says he went into a business meeting, and he sat down, and everybody's waiting with bated breath. What he's going to say, and he says, "All right, everybody, raise your hand if you think you've had a tougher week than me." And everybody laughed. And, all right, let's just focus on business. And that's exactly the technique that Cicero and Quintilian tell you to do. So it was like a master class in how to reset social dynamics.
Do you know if anybody raised their hand when he asked that question? Because that would take moxie. Oh, that would be incredible.
Try this. So when I have done department meetings or group meetings in higher ed, we all sit down. If we're about to make a decision, I say, before we vote, raise your hand if you're against groupthink.
Yeah.
And everybody immediately raises their hand. Does everybody want to give the opposite point of view before we vote?
Yeah, I sometimes ask groups, raise your hands if you're against democracy, right? And I think you said there are that you've served on 37 separate committees at Cornell. Is that right? Big Red?
Yes. So I started out. About 10 years ago, I decided to get more involved in Central University administration. So I spent about a decade doing this stuff.
For the joy of it, right?
Exactly. What else is there? No, it was for all the money. They paid me a fortune. No. It was more like Cicero's on duties. No. So I volunteered, that I don't know why, to run all these faculty senate committees that we have. And, everybody's got their student council. We have a faculty council. And I thought when I first volunteered, it'd be a very minimal commitment. It turned out that the person in charge wanted me to attend all of the meetings. And so at first I was aghast. And then over time, I was like, I'm learning more about this university than anyone on campus.
Right.
So I went to all these meetings. I wish I had not gone to all of them. But yeah, I went to, you name it, we did it. The parking committee, the benefits committee, the education committee. But it actually is good. So
party planning committee, right?
Yeah, that one I missed. But it is cool. If anybody's an academic listening, I would encourage you to get involved in the same thing, maybe at your own institution. Wow. In part because you can learn a lot about it. And it doesn't take long before you know more about the way these huge places are run than almost anybody on campus.
Wow. And is there any humor in it, though, is what I would like to know.
Mike, you brought the humor to all of these meetings, right? I hope.
I did, yes.
Of course.
Yes. And so mine was a volunteer position, but I was in charge. And everybody that came to these committees was also a volunteer. And when you ask a lot of people to volunteer their time, they don't always want to do it. And we would assemble these committees. Every committee was an ad hoc grouping of people. And Cornell here is gigantic. I think we have something like 3,000 faculty if you count in all the various appointments.
Oh my! Wow.
It's maybe not quite that many, but close. And so we would often walk into a room full of strangers, and you've got, the brain scientist and the chemical engineer and the mathematician and the humanities person. And you say, how are you going to get these people on the same page to work toward whatever the goal is? And so I found that using humor got more buy-in than any other tool I had at my disposal.
Incredible. Sure. So I have two questions. Final questions for myself. Jeff may have a few others, but the first one is something we didn't cover last time, and that is the captatio benevolentiae, right? Getting people's goodwill at the beginning of a speech, the captatio. What's your preference? self-deprecating or some kind of joke at the audience's expense, a little bit of a needling or helping them not take themselves too seriously? Which do you think is most effective?
Can I pick a third choice?
Sure.
Yeah.
If you don't care for false dichotomies, go ahead.
I mean, if you're going to trap me like this. So if you want to be a leader in public, Cicero and Quintilian are crystal clear. Don't tell jokes at your own expense. Just don't. Now, the one time you do is when you're busted. If the police officer pulls you over and you've been speeding, that is the time to do it. Or, the newspaper calls and, you've been caught doing something naughty. A joke can spare you at your own expense. I also wouldn't, if I didn't have to, tell a joke at the audience's expense, if I could find a good neutral third party. So I have a couple of go-to jokes. Everybody should get some go-to jokes. A great one, though, is if you walk into a meeting and there's 15 or 20 people there and everybody's drinking coffee, you can just hold up your coffee mug and say, I have a question. If I get hit with this thing, have I been mugged?
That's what we call a bad pun, Fontaine.
It is a bad pun, but that one shows effort. That works well in small groups.
It's great.
And then they say, no, come on, we just got to lighten up. I need to finish my coffee and then we'll get it.
When I was an undergrad, I was washing out a ceramic mug, true story, and it was sharp because it was cut and it cut my finger and I had to go get stitches for this. And thereafter, I told everyone I was mugged. So the second question is, last time we talked about the inability to turn off the funny, right? Certain individuals, and Cicero seems to have been one of these, right? He lost his sense of location, you might say, and the wit just poured out of him so effusively, it actually landed him in a lot of hot water.
Cicero makes this point emphatically at almost the very beginning of his treatise. Although the speaker, a guy named Caesar, does. He says, if you're a quick-witted person, the hardest thing in the world is to hold back a joke. I mean, you're sitting there and somebody says something double-edged, and if you're ready to exploit it and make a joke, you've got to bite your tongue. He says, it's like your mouth is on fire. It's easier to put out the flames than make that wisecrack. You're just dying to do it.
Yeah.
And if you're a quick-witted person, you know that this is true, right? And so, a mark of maturity, a mark of self-preservation is you don't say these things.
Right.
I don't have a spotless record of this myself, but I try very hard because it's easy to hurt somebody's feelings that way. But yes, sure. I put this stuff into the introduction. I said, the crazy thing is Cicero himself, here he is in his treatise giving us this advice. And then when he was assassinated about 12 years later, 11 years later, this is the thing that his ancient biographer Plutarch cites as one of the reasons that he fell afoul of Mark Antony. He couldn't keep his stupid mouth shut. He keeps making all these jokes. And so it's ironic in a way that I don't think Cicero could have possibly ever foreseen. It's good advice. If you're ready, if you want to land a sick burn, grandma says something, opens the door at Thanksgiving or don't.
Yeah, hold back. So I don't know if I'm a witty person, but this phenomenon usually happens to me like at a faculty meeting, right? Or a department meeting. I think, there's a golden opportunity. I'm going to lose it if I don't take it, but you got to hold back. Yeah. So Jeff, you have any wrap-up questions for Mike?
I do. My last question would be about the context that Quintilian is writing. It struck me that, you mentioned, Trajan and Hadrian, is if you see that as kind of an era where, again, get humor's back on the table, the kind of the post-Augustan Julio-Claudian era seems to be a pretty dry spell for humor. You have Petronius, who may have paid for his humor with his own life, but you start to get figures like Martial, Juvenal, Lucian, Apuleius. Do you see that as kind of part of Quintilian is part of the second sophistic, where it's a little bit looser, it's a little bit more open for these kinds of discussions. It's a little bit open for the comedian.
It's a great question again. I think I'd probably say Quintilian's in a separate category from all those other authors, right?
Okay.
When I think of Juvenal, I think of Lucian, I think of the satirical writers, that sort of thing. Martial, that's definitely witty, and it's witty in a refined way. But there, I think the the aim seems to be to entertain people much more. And Quintilian is pretty clear that he is here to instrumentalize humor for you as a leader, as a public figure, anybody speaking in public, for you to get ahead.
Gotcha.
And so the joke, the first thing he would say is, if the joke is not going to win your court case or win your election or win whatever you're trying to sell, then don't do humor. So for him, it's just a tool in the kit. And I think the other authors are all funny, but in different ways.
Well, we want to thank you again, Mike, for not only recording the first time, but recording the second time and making it even better than the first time.
Absolutely.
And we're so grateful. Any parting words of wisdom to our listeners who may be aspiring classicists, aspiring comedians?
Aspiring classicists, learn Latin, learn it well. Latin is a wonderful language, and it doesn't take that much to get really good at it.
Awesome.
Keep at it. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you very much. Again, we want to thank our guest, Michael Fontaine, so much for coming on. We have some more people to thank, don't we, Jeff?
We do. Mishka, our intrepid engineer, as always, does a wonderful job. Scott Van Zen and Ken Tamplin for the great music that you hear in the podcast. Always indebted and very thankful to these people.
Right. And I'm going to talk for just a brief half second about the Moss Method. Why not spend your summer learning Greek?
Why not?
Why not? Go to mossmethod.com. Check out my program. It is expert, self-paced, and accessible. Also, it's inexpensive. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, and we're going to be running a summer promo, so stay tuned in subsequent episodes. Jeff, what do we have coming up next week?
Oh, man, I'm excited. We're going to do the Mysteries of Mithras.
The Mysteries of Mithras?
Yes.
What kind of a creature is that?
The worship of Mithras was what we call mystery cult in the ancient world, and it was very popular, very widespread through a good chunk of the Roman Empire, deeply influential, and really intriguing and mysterious in every sense of that word.
This is some area where you have quite a bit of expertise, so you're going to be taking the lead in this.
Absolutely.
And we're going to go through that.
Yeah.
So listeners, be sure to check that out. Please subscribe, leave a review at your favorite podcast site. We continue to get wonderful listener mail. Dave at adnauseum.com or Jeff at adnauseum.com. Don't forget, Nauseum has a V in it. And Jeff, I think you have the gustatory parting shot. Is that right?
I do. And once again, I'm borrowing from the realm of pop music.
That's you, isn't it?
It is, exactly. And this comes from Pink Floyd, from their song Another Brick in the Wall. If you don't eat your meat, you can't have any pudding. How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat?
Indeed. How can you?
How can you?
Thanks for listening. Thanks.